All right, so we're going to be in Deuteronomy 12. And what I want to do is I want to think, because we did Deuteronomy 12 in the sermon, but I want to back up a little bit and just slow down and go through, because obviously in the sermon, you just have to go, in 22 minutes or whatever it was, or 29, depending on which, because yesterday in the evening service, I must have been cold or something, because I got through my sermon in about 21 minutes. And Jeff timed me on Friday, and I think it was about 28. So somehow the people that came last night either listened faster or they or they like got 6 minutes less. I don't know. I don't remember it being 6 minutes less, but it somehow was. So before we do that, though, we're now we've been in Deuteronomy for a while, and we've kind of talked a little bit about Leviticus. So I just wanted to open it up and see if there are any questions or anything that we haven't, that sort of sparked an idea or something over the last couple of weeks, and we can talk about those. I want to give you opportunity to ask questions.
I think I'm okay.
Okay. All right. So hopefully we'll keep the internet, because the wind is like crazy here right now.
Yeah, certainly is.
Insane. So, all right. So let's look back. Remember Deuteronomy once again. Deuteronomy is it's a kind of a long sermon, one long kind of sermon, and it is one of the things they're doing is preparing them. Now, remember, we talked about this last week, I think. If you look at the 10 commandments, so the first 4 are, well, let's say the first 3 are about God. The 4th is keep the Sabbath holy, which is kind of, it does have to do with God, but also then begins to branch out into our personal relationships. And then 5 through 10 are primarily interpersonal, right, with human beings. So the first part is mostly about God. The second part is mostly about human beings. We are now in the section where we're primarily still in the first 3, but starting this week, we're going to be into the part about dealing with other people. And so that's how Deuteronomy is kind of structured. If you look at the first part of it, it's mostly oriented to the 10 commandments, in the 10 commandments, the first 3, and then later it'll be, so we're going to get to what does it mean to be generous, and how does generosity have to do with, thou shalt not steal, or that, and Leviticus says, it sums them all up and says, love your neighbor as yourself. So we're going to see how justice and generosity and those kinds of things that are built into the structures of Israel, how they support the 10 commandments, and how they really are just an outworking of the 10 commandments. So let's talk about worship, because worship essentially plays into the first 2 commandments. If you look at the first 2 commandments, they are about worship. The third one is also honor God's name. Don't take God's name in vain, is also in very many ways about worship, but it's a lot about God's identity. And we'll see that kind of play out when he talks about prophets and worshiping other gods and things like that. But let's look at chapter 12. And I think most people really don't read a lot of these. And so a lot of times when you say these things, they take people by surprise. So he says in chapter 12, verse 1, he says, these are the decrees and laws you must be careful to follow in the land that the Lord, the God of your ancestors, has given you to possess, as long as you live in this land. Destroy completely all the places on the high mountains and on the hills and under every spreading tree where the nations you are dispossessing worship their gods. Break down the altars, smash their sacred stones, and burn their Asherah poles in the fire. Cut down the idols of their gods and wipe out the names of those places. Wipe out their names from those places. You must not worship the Lord your God in their way, but you are to seek the place the Lord your God will choose from among all your tribes to put his name there for a dwelling. To that place you must go. There bring your burnt offerings and sacrifices, your tithes and special gifts, what you have vowed to give, and your free will offerings, and the firstborn of your herds and your flocks. There, in the presence of the Lord your God, you and your family shall eat and shall rejoice in everything you have put your hand to, because the Lord your God has blessed you. All right, so let's stop there. The sermon yesterday picked up in verse 8, but I wanted to see the background. Now, what is the command that he's giving, right? He's giving the command to cut down destroy all of the high places and the places where they worshiped. Now, what did you notice? There are a couple places. If you were reading, where did it say that they were worshiping the other people? They use these phrases. What physical locations were they using? Do you remember? There are,
Well, do you,
like,
are
when
you,
the other people, he says, you don't worship where they worship, and where do they worship? Do you remember?
the,
It's
under trees and
under
yeah,
trees and on hills.
high places.
Right. So essentially, remember, if the world is organized the way that it would make sense to go to the highest place you could find, because there you'd be closer to God, right? In that sort of idea. Remember in Genesis 8, where they build the Tower of Babel and it goes up,
yeah,
right? There's this idea that obviously, so what they've done is that they go up on high hills, or remember, they're in the ancient Near East, and it's mostly, Janie's driving through the desert right now. Imagine if you're driving through the desert and you see a huge tree, something, I don't know honestly, I don't know the flora and fauna of the ancient Near East that well, but think about like seeing a cottonwood, in the middle, where it's like somehow it's got roots deep into some underground stream, and it's just isolated out there. Those are often considered sacred spaces. And so you would go, and if you look at the prophets, particularly Jeremiah and Ezekiel, who are both priests, they talk about worshiping on every high hill and under every spreading tree. They use that language almost, verbatim. And so the idea is they're not to worship there. This is not nature worship, right? There's the way that they've incorporated that into their service, their worship. You're not supposed to worship that way. You're only supposed to worship in one place, and that is the temple. And it's one designated place. Now, there are a couple of reasons. Why do you think God would limit? Like, why would he limit worship to one space? Why? What's the deal?
well, for one thing, it's mixing up who you're worshiping.
Mm-hmm.
It's making an idol,
Right.
in essence, of a tree,
Right.
whereas God is in the temple.
Right. And how would you know? I mean, one of the questions is that there's also a sense in which they want the worship to be performed correctly. And how would you know if it was being done correctly? What would you need? Who would you need?
Other than reading the book of Leviticus?
Right, which, remember, most people wouldn't have been able to read. Right, so you need what?
Other Christians.
Yes, you need other people,
Well,
particularly.
they're not Christians yet.
Yeah. But you need worshipers. But you also need trained worshipers. You need people to know how to do it correctly. And Brother Jeff here, you would think about, if you were going to sign a contract, you'd want somebody with you who actually knew what they were doing, right? When you're worshiping, you need someone to oversee and to make sure it's being done correctly. Remember, one of the things that we see in the book of Leviticus, and it's one of the most important stories, and in fact, it's one of the only stories in the book of Leviticus. It's in Leviticus chapter 10, and it's the story of Nadab and Abihu, Aaron's two sons, that are killed because they're worshiping incorrectly, right? And so that's one. There are only two stories in the book of Leviticus, and that's one of them. So it's one of those framing stories, and the reason the Levitical laws are there is for Israel's protection. If God's living in their midst, they need protection, because God's powerful, holy presence, if it comes into contact with anything that's impure or death related, it kills it. So once again, I use the analogy. Imagine if in your town you had a nuclear reactor, there would be some laws to protect you from, because a nuclear reactor is a dangerous thing. It's not something you just, higgledy-piggledy go about, playing with. You have to be careful with it. And because God is more dangerous than a nuclear reactor, told to us precisely by the story of Nadab and Abihu, there needs to be. So one of the reasons why there's a centralized worship space is so that the worship can be overseen. right? So it's not just people up on the hills trying to worship wherever they want. It's actually, there's a, I don't know, a centralized, standards and practices, right? It's like this needs to be done correctly, or else bad things could happen. And so, so there's a certain sense in which they're having it centrally located, make sure that there are people trained to do it correctly. And that seems odd to us as Americans. We are so democratized that we think that any of us, we should just be able to do whatever we want. The idea that there would be someone to oversee it, I think in many ways strikes us as, very un-American, right? This is very, it's almost offensive to us, the idea that we would somehow need to worship correctly, right? For us, we're like, we should worship any way we want. If I want to worship at the lake while I'm fishing, or if I want to worship at the casino, I just, I can worship wherever, like there was a sense in which, no, there's some real actual, structure, and it needs to be done correctly, because the God in your midst is dangerous if mishandled. And that was always that was just always something in the back of Israel's mind, these stories of Leviticus. So chapter 8 is going to be similar. And then we're going to start with some other, I think more, I've kind of given you the parts of this that most Americans find offensive, right? This is the part, but let's also talk about some of the good things here. So verse 8, and we'll read through 8 through 14. He says, you are not to do as we do. You are not to do as we do here today, everyone doing as they see fit. Since you have not yet reached the resting place and the inheritance of the Lord your God, the inheritance the Lord your God is giving you. But you will cross the Jordan and settle in the land the Lord your God is giving you as an inheritance, and he will give you rest from all your enemies around you so that you will live in safety. Then to the place the Lord your God will choose as a dwelling for his name, there you are to bring everything I command you, your burnt offerings and your sacrifices, your tithes and special gifts, and all the choice possessions you have vowed to the Lord. And there rejoice before the Lord your God, you, your sons, your daughters, your male, female servants, the Levites from your towns who have no allotment or no inheritance of their own. Be careful not to sacrifice your burnt offerings anywhere you please. Offer them only at the place the Lord your God will choose in one of your tribes, and there observe everything I command you. All right. So there was a couple of phrases that between 8 and verse 1 and verse 14 that repeated. And those are, anytime we see something repeat, underline it or highlight it or whatever you do with it. There are a couple of places that I think are important. One, it says, verse 7, it says, there in the presence of the Lord your God, you and your family shall eat and shall rejoice in everything you have put your hand to, because the Lord your God has blessed you. So that's one. So either highlight it or circle it or whatever. Then he says in verse 12, and there rejoice before the Lord your God. Right there it is. And then there's also in verse, we're going to skip down a little bit. We didn't read this section, but you'll see it. In verse 18, he says, and you are to rejoice before the Lord your God in everything you put your hand to. Right there. So the idea of rejoicing is built into these systems. These are, remember, most of these times when people lived far away. In order to travel to, in order to worship, most people had to travel, right? I mean, if the temple or the tabernacle in that place, because remember the temple isn't built until Solomon, right? And we're about 200 years away from Solomon at this point. So remember, so the tabernacle was the substitute. I mean, it served that function until the temple was built. So but the temple ended up in Jerusalem, which is kind of south central, right? But most people would have to travel. And so these would be days of pilgrimage. They would be days of, but they were also built around festivals, and they were built around, after harvest. These are times of rejoicing. And most of the sacrifices that are offered, we tend to think of sacrifices as things we do because we did something bad, right? We think of the sacrificial system that way. And there's a
Atonement.
section of it. Yes, exactly. I didn't use that word, but it's the word atonement, right? I do something bad, something has to die in order for there to be reconciliation. There's a part of the law that's that, but most of the worship is done out of, in other words, we would think of it as tithing, right? That's how we would think of it, right? You don't tithe because you're guilty. Well, I mean, some people tithe because they're guilty. I mean, I shouldn't say nobody does, but some people probably do. But most of us tithe not out of guilt, but out of devotion, right? And so what happens is this is a time when you're bringing your first fruits of harvest. So these are celebratory times. And I didn't mention this in the sermon because I couldn't put everything in. I've always, when you write a sermon, you're always like, well, I could fit about another 45 minutes in if I had 45 more minutes, right? But you don't have 45 more minutes. So this is one of the things that I think is that worship in the Old Testament, we think of it as drudgery, and we think of it as mostly, as Jeff said, as atonement, as making sacrifices for the bad things we've done. But that's a very small part. Most of it is saying, God, you've blessed me so greatly. I'm going to bring my offering to you out of trust and out of, and this is a rejoicing. This is devotion, right? And remember, worship is really important because that when you bring that first fruit of your flock, you're bringing that to God and you're saying, God, you have blessed me beyond anything I deserve. Remember, Deuteronomy is constantly saying, God didn't pick you, Israel, because you're the best or because you're the biggest or because you're the most righteous, right? He says, in fact, you proved you were the opposite of all of that. So he says, so Israel would come and these people would say, God has blessed me and he's blessed us as a nation, and we're giving back to God out of the abundance that he's given to us. And these are rejoicing time. Worship is about rejoicing, and it should be about rejoicing. There's another word that I think is really important that we need to think about, and it's in verse, let's see. It is in verse, where we go? It's the word rest, and I'll see it in here. He says, you've not, in verse 9, he says, in verse 8, he says, you are not to do as we do here today, everyone doing as they see fit, since you have not reached the resting place. So so you can circle that word. And then he says in verse 10, but you will cross the Jordan River and settle in the Lord your God is giving you as an inheritance, and he will give you rest. There's that other word, so you can circle that, from all your enemies around you, so that you will live in safety. The word rest is important. Remember, and if you've ever read the book of Hebrews, in fact, if you have time, Hebrews is an interesting book. If you've never read it, Hebrews is the book that is probably the most not the most connected, but it's the one that makes the most sort of overt connections to the Old Testament. And it's that word rest is very important, especially when you get to the book of Hebrews. And the concept is that, remember, Israel is wandering around and wandering around and wandering around in the wilderness for 40 years. And finally, they are going to find rest. Now, that word rest gets picked up, right? Jesus says, come to me, all you who are weary, and I will give you rest, right? The book of Hebrews says that the people of Israel were wandering around and then finally found their rest. And it talks about, and remember, the book of Hebrews is written to where, probably, during maybe after the time of the destruction of the temple, there's this idea that we find our rest in God. And the word rest is this idea of calmness. And you can think of Psalm 23, right? These quiet waters, you will lay down. These are the ideas here. And rest is an important concept because, and think about how, as modern 21st century people, how unrested we are. And I don't just mean like lack of sleep. I just mean we're constantly stirred up. within us. And we're constantly, we're constantly seeking more. We're constantly worried. We're constantly working. You don't even, I mean, if you have a, if you're working now, you don't even get days off hardly anymore, because, you work from home and you have an email, and you're going to always get people can always get in touch with you. So this concept of rest is really, really important for the Bible. And Augustine picks that up because of his sort of philosophical underpinnings, and he picks that up and uses that quite a bit. So worship, in some sense, you could actually, if I were going to preach a sermon, and I should probably about rest, I would talk about how worship is like is where our heart's home is. That if you were going to pick that concept up, that when we worship, it's like our heart finds its home. And that's why also I think why worship is such an important concept. This idea of rest and being, resting in God, that God, one of the things God wants us to do is not be quite so stirred up. And so anyway, I think as you look through these, you read, very often we just so quickly read through the Bible. I know I do, that I very often miss it. And so when I go back and then kind of look at things, so we're just about out of time.
Like that. I really like that, where your heart finds its home.
Mm-hmm.
That's lovely.
Right. And it's a nice concept. And that's a concept from Jesus, and then, Hebrews. And the other thing is, though, is that it's a home, but remember, there's still within that, there's still the structure of Deuteronomy and Leviticus that's underpinning it, that sort of, and it gives you these, I mean, think about, like, if you're doing these things every, periods of years, your kids, you would be raised up, going to the temple, and there was a sacrifice, and it was a festival, and it was, celebratory, and you could see how that would really shape and transform your view of the world if it was done correctly, right? You could just think
it's not all hearts and flowers, Lee.
It isn't, but yeah, it is, but it is nice. But no, what I mean is that the idea is that think about, I mean, obviously you could just go through the motions. That's always the problem with a book like Leviticus and Deuteronomy. It would be easy to go through the motions where there was no hearts and flowers associated with it, right? That's always the problem. Americans, I'm not Americans, human beings we either tend to try to be everything, or, like the pendulum swings, and the Bible very often is somewhere here. It's the emotions are an incredible part of it, because otherwise it's just going through the motions. But it's also, you can't willy-nilly do whatever you want. It's like there's the Bible just sort of fits in, neatly in this, like, in between, or unneatly, I guess, in between the two poles that we have. But it is, you find worship is not just about, filling out paperwork. Worship is an emotional, it's about rejoicing, and it's about finding rest, and it should, pull together all the parts of a human being. The more I read the Old Testament, the more I'm so struck by how whole life it is, right? It's not just about our brains. It's not just about our emotions. It's not just about our bodies. It pulls every aspect of what it means to be human, and it holds them all together, and realizes that worship is holistic, that devotion is holistic. It's not a, you know what I mean? It just encompasses everything. And that's one of the things, if there's one thing that I'm sad that the American church doesn't get, it's that because we've moved the Old Testament just into the basement, because we've done that, we've lost that whole sense of devotion. We don't have that big sense of it. And I think that's sad. I think it's, once you start looking at it, once you get past the strangeness of the Old Testament and you begin to just wrestle with it, you go, yeah, there's a whole lot of this very beautiful, holistic, whole body devotion that's in it. And so I mean, if there's anything else I think America needs, it's probably that. But there's a lot of things America needs because we've gotten rid of the Old Testament out of our worship, and it's too bad.
It
I have
gives
a
it,
quick question.
Yeah, go ahead.
And you can put it over to the next session if you want. I was struck when you were doing the Friday taping by the repeated use of the word inheritance in that passage from Deuteronomy. And of course, I immediately thought of like Jacob and Esau and the birthright and all that. And I'm just wondering, what Moses repeats that enough times that there must be some significance to it that would have struck home in that day, more
Yeah.
so than perhaps nowadays.
I think so. And the other question, and so Jeff, why don't we do that? Why don't we start Wednesday with that question? I'll make a note and we'll just start
Okay.
because it's time to go. But why don't we start with that question? The other question is, the land is so important in the Old Testament, right? The inheritance, as you talk about, and inheritance, and Israel is inheriting this land. And once we get to the New Testament, there's not much talk about land anymore. And then that builds into there's all the questions, which, by the way, I'm not going to answer, but I mean, there's all the question: does Israel still have a legitimate biblical case to the land today? Right? I mean, we could talk about it. I mean, I don't know that I got good, solid answers, but I mean, when I say I won't answer it, it's not that I don't want to. It's that it's so much more complicated. But what do we do with the land? You know, the Old Testament is so focused on land, and then once we get to the New Testament, the land is, you know, Paul doesn't really mention it. Hebrews sort of does. So that's a good question, I think, all the way around. What do we think of as inheritance? How does the New Testament sort of re-image that, reimagine that? So that's a good question, Jeff. Are you going to be here Wednesday? Hey, Jeff, are you going to be here Wednesday?
Probably.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm here. I'm in the car, so the signal's probably coming and going.
That's okay. Well, regardless, I want to answer your question, Jeff. So we'll start Wednesday with that. If you can't be here Wednesday, it'll be on Facebook and YouTube. You can look at it there.
Right.
To get the question answered.
Excellent.
All right.
Okay.
Thank you guys so much. I love you. Everybody who's driving, be careful. Janie, have a good time in Texas, and make sure that you root for the Dodgers, and I'm very jealous that you're going to get to go to the game. So.
Thank you, Lee. It's good to see you.
All right. I love you guys. See you soon.
thanks,
Bye,
Lee.
Martha. Bye, Nancy.
Bye, Janie. Drive
Bye,
carefully. Bye, Jeff.
Thank you.
Bye.
I will.